Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right. Welcome, everyone, here in person and online. Today is Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. Wow, we're that far into the next century. It is 1:30 p.m., and this panel number is 17977. That's also the PIN to my checking account. So today we are here for a panel entitled A Dying Art, Are Books, Theater, Radio, Movies, Museums, and TV Now Dinosaurs? My name's Matt Benjamin. I used to actually work here at the university in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, and used to run the Fisk Planetarium just down the road a little bit. Now I'm a photographer and fortunate enough to be an elected representative to Boulder City Council. But before we get started, we're going to do a little housekeeping. And first, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and cultural sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in climate that is inclusive and respectful. Now with that, we're going to move into a little bit of just sort of how we're going to handle Q&A, so everyone's prepared. We will reserve time at the end of this discussion for Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. Those will come to me throughout the session. If you would like to pose a question, simply raise your hand at any time during the session to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. And you can see in the back there, raising our hands, our wonderful producers. They will keep me on task. That's why I'm near the stairs, so in case vaudevillian-wise, they can yank me off stage if I'm doing a poor job. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on your card. We'll give preference to students. When you finish writing your question, raise your hand to hand the card back to the producer who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. Please no long preambles or chicken scratch. I probably won't be able to make all questions submitted, but I may combine similar questions that are thematically connected. Now I'd like to do a brief introduction of our panelists. You can find their full bios on the CWA website if you don't already have them in front of you. So first up, I'd like to introduce Dean Sobel, Associate Professor of Practice of Art History and Museum Studies at DU. Before joining the faculty at DU in 2020, Dean led an extensive art museum career, creating the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, and was the director and chief curator for the Aspen Art Museum and the Milwaukee Art Museum. Dean's work has spanned a broad spectrum from a multitude of artists to creating major single artist exhibitions. A little fun fact about Dean is he used to play in rock and roll bands and played drums and guitar. Next, I'd like to introduce Michael Spencer, who's a freelance performance maker, director, and writer. With a background in theater design, performance, and directing, Michael has built a career in pulling the audience in and immersing them into a space and/or mood. In fact, in 1991, Michael became the first person in the UK to receive an MA in theater design. His work covers an array of subject matter and locations, from mathematics to public participation in public spaces. An interesting fun fact about Michael: in his theatrical design for the adaptation of The Anatomy of Integers and Permutations by Andrew and Jennifer Granville, Michael came up with the idea to use paper corpses to represent the research, and the autopsies would literally reveal the mathematics. I mean, it's very CSI-like, but I thought that was a fascinating and thought-provoking way to convey mathematic permutations and integers. Next, I'd like to introduce Maya Ward, who's the director of 92NY, School Engagement in the Arts. Maya has been leading the organization's work in engaging with teens and youth. Through programs like Teen Producers, she has kept the multifaceted nature of the arts and theater front and center for these students. Celebrating their 150th anniversary, N2Y has expanded its footprint globally and continues to host a pantheon of classes and events for all to enjoy. And also a fun fact is that 92NY's 150th anniversary was this year, and not everyone gets to have an anniversary and then also be an actual category on Jeopardy. And N2NY on the March 15 episode was actually was a category on Jeopardy. So that's pretty cool. Last but not least, I want to introduce Matt Williams, television producer, writer, and professor at Columbia. You may not know Matt by name, but we all know his work. As a creator and executive producer of popular shows, Roseanne, Home Improvement, many others, he was also writer and producer of The Cosby Show. He was nominated for an Emmy and won a Peabody Award for Outstanding Achievement in Television Writing. Matt is currently an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University School of the Arts program. Now, fun fact about Matt, and if Coach Prime is listening, you know, this is an interesting connection here. He paid for his school through a football scholarship. And so he was a football player and a theater major. So I'd like to know if any of our football players are entertaining a similar combination. And he did that at the University of Evansville. So I thought that was really fascinating as well. So now that we've got our introductions through, we want to just sort of open it up for our panelists, just sort of say, 3 to 4 minutes, just a little bit about their work and how it connects to this panel's subject matter, and just sort of let them riff and engage in their own conversation among their expertise from their diverse backgrounds. And so with that, I'm going to start with Dean and see if Dean wants to give that a go, and then we'll move down the line.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very interested in this topic, and it's very close to not only my museum work, but my museum studies teaching at DU. But I think what's central, at least to the way I'm thinking about this topic and new technologies and so-called dying art forms, is the question, is there really an audience, and I'll speak on behalf of art museum field industry, for what I would call pure art experiences? And I guess I would describe that a work of art, take your pick, what are your favorite works of art, in a quiet, well-lit, air-conditioned, beautiful, sort of space, comfy chair, nowhere to go, nowhere to get to, and you have that kind of singular moment, if you will, with an individual work of art. I think what's at the base of a lot of what we're talking about, and it's one of these overused words like lean in or curated, the fact that we're in a kind of experience economy, a marketing term that started with, Hard Rock Cafe, maybe even Apple stores. Shopping for a phone is now an experience. You hear it in almost every context now, experience of going to the supermarket. And I think that is what has driven what is in fact becoming a real challenging aspect of at least the art museum field. Things like virtual Van Gogh, I think you'll know what I'm talking about, these kinds of reproductive media, very little educational value, but it's a pure entertainment experience. Things, even in the Denver area, some of you who are local would know we have things like Instagram museums, places where you go primarily to be seen and post and sort of express your individuality through these kinds of institutions. And I think, obviously, being someone who's been in the field a long time, I think there isn't the same audience, and particularly as our demographics and our visitorship ages out. And I'm sort of fascinated too that we didn't include in this title of the panel, but we'll certainly touch on it, opera, ballet, classical music. I think all of these are industries, art forms, venues and institutions that are having a hard time attracting these younger audiences. But at the same time, I have a lot of difficulty equating that pure experience, and I realize that's a problematic term too, but that experience of the real, the actual engagement with a work of art, and you and your body and the phenomenological experience of being with works of art, compared to all these other things that I think are not only problematic, but they don't have the same mission and values, and honestly are probably more expensive to attend, now closer to things like football games or Broadway shows than the $20, $25, $30 in New York that art museums are able to get from what is admittedly a much larger audience than what we had in the 70s pre-King Tut. But these are things I think about every day, and things that I think are becoming very challenging to what I hold dear in an art museum experience. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Dean. Michael.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, the title of this panel seems to imply criticism of the fact that you can now do all of these things online without leaving your home and without engaging with other human beings, but I don't think it's all negative. So, for example, if you can't afford a West End or a Broadway theatre ticket price, as I can't, but you can afford going to the cinema to see a live screening of that show, as I did recently, that's not a bad thing. If you're physically disabled or you have mobility issues and you can't get to a museum or a gallery or a theatre, you can now see these things online. Good thing. If your family life is so chaotic that you can't enjoy your favourite TV show in the evening on your television, you can now watch it on your iPhone in your lunch break. Okay. Now you could, in each of these cases, argue that the content is the same. Maybe. There's the rub, I think. In a book, it's exactly the same, right? Because if you're reading words from a page, it's the same as if you're reading on a screen. The words are the same. However, we, or certainly my generation, tend to fetishize books. We quite like, the smell of them and the way the pages yellow with age. There's something about them that we like. So if books were only online, would I read fewer? Probably. Theatre's my subject, which is tricky. So the American theatre academic Peggy Phelan wrote at the end of the last century that theatre only exists in the moment of delivery in that particular time and place. So for a live screening, as I just described in the cinema, are we really having the same experience as those people in the actual theatre? So when we're in the cinema, it's the camera that's dictating what we look at. The sound is very different than if we're in the actual theatre. The spatial relationship between the spectator and the performer is different. So I'd argue maybe it is different. Museums and art galleries, I've got to mention the essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin, German academic, written in 1935, because he talks about the significance of the authentic artifact as opposed to its replication. He calls this the aura of the object, and it's the aura which attracts us. So why do we queue for hours to see The Last Supper in Milan when we can get it on our phone with a few clicks? It's the aura of the actual object. Benjamin approves of the fact that it's more democratic, lots of people could now see different works, but he knows that something is missing, as it is, I think, when I'm watching a theatre piece in a cinema, or when you see your favourite nature programme shrunk to the screen of your iPhone. It's not quite the same. So I love painting, and I go to art galleries to see them because online I've got no idea of the scale that I have, say, when I'm standing in front of a 15-foot by 10-foot Jackson Pollock abstract canvas. It's kind of different than when it's there. I can't see the texture of the paint online. The colours are different on a backlit screen because the colours on a backlit screen are the ones produced by Apple and Samsung, and I want to see the actual thing the artist saw when they finished the work. That's why I go to galleries. But that's me. And that's different from the way, perhaps, let's think about how young people experience museums and the clues in experience, as Dean has pointed out. They don't want to look at objects objects in cases. They want experiences. They want to dress up in clothes of the last century, or they want to ride in a space capsule as if it's in a splashdown with real water, both of which I've done with my kids in recent years, and both of which are going to be completely taken over by VR very soon. However, they did all take place in a building called a museum. And if you want to just look at things in objects in vases, well, once again, like looking at paintings, you'll get something more than the flat screen. Because who looks at any image on a screen for more than 5 seconds? Very few people, I would argue. The other fact I've not time to discuss here is the fact that we normally experience these things as a collective rather than a solitary experience when looking online. This is the first generation to be entertained and experience culture in isolation. And I think only time will tell the consequences of that shift from the collective to the individual experience. So to conclude, yeah, books, theatres, museums, galleries, they're not dinosaurs, but the way we are experiencing them, I think, is different. But that's not a bad thing, because we don't all have to experience them in the same way. So if in future museums feature 360 VR experiences where transported back in time and place, I think that's great. But some people might just prefer to have a look at an Etruscan vase in a case. So we need to allow for both. We need to hold on to recognizing the significance of the actual object in its aura, as Benjamin would say. We need to not be seduced by the presentation to the extent that we forget the content of what we're actually looking at, and maybe value the shared experience as well.
Thank you, Michael. Maya.
Well, thank you, Michael, for bringing that perspective, because I do think as arts professionals, it's easy to get quite fatalistic about all of this. When I was presented with the question of, are these forms becoming dinosaurs, I thought to myself, God, I hope not. These are the forms that shaped me as a person. But I also think I'm a pretty fundamentally positive person, and there is a lot of good to be drawn out of these conversations. You know, I too believe in the need for these communal and physical experiences of art. I think they'll always be needed and wanted. I think there's something about these creative mediums that's now needed more than ever to fight the feelings of isolation and detachment that we all have. And I think, you know, in the world of streaming, sometimes I do get a little bit fatalistic about how it feels like in this age, culture has a vacant and hollow sort of feeling of everything being driven by an algorithm. But I think it's a choice to a certain extent of where we put our efforts and how we innovate creative processes, as Michael and Dean have talked about, and, you know, transform our industries to meet the moment. I approach my education work from an education lens, and so I think a lot about how we're educating our young audiences, how we're building the next generation of thinkers and writers and performers and audience members and professionals across these industries. And what I see every day in my work is that art remains an incredibly important part of young people's lives. You know, I was recently in our concert hall with 800 students with jazz clarinetist Anat Cohen, and you would think she was Beyonce. I mean, these students were going nuts. They were going crazy for this music, and the energy that was in the room was really unique and undeniable. And I think the reason for that is that we had 8 sessions of teaching artists going into classrooms, teaching about these artistic forms, having students feel the music and the movement in their bodies so that when they were in the concert hall, they were empowered audience members. So really thinking about, when it comes to live arts in particular, how are we really engaging students in a deeper way? You know, and I think when it comes to live arts in particular, one common misconception at the heart of conversations I have is that the issue with young people and audience engagement is that it's a lack of interest. And I think what we're not talking about enough is that it's one of financial inaccessibility. You know, ticket prices for live arts experiences are unaffordable for many Americans, especially in New York. But a minimum wage job can, you know, allow you to pay for a subscription service easily. So that's, you know, something to take into account. And I think there's a parallel problem in schools when we think about access. You know, I think we all know in recent years, school districts have seen huge budget cuts to arts programming. That alongside, you know, the troubling rise of book banning pose a real threat to youth engagement in the arts. And they send, I think, you know, implicit and explicit messages that the arts don't matter. So, you know, these are all questions I'm grappling with in my work, and I'm so grateful to be here to discuss with you all.
Thanks, Maya. Matt, you're up.
Good. I will give you my personal arc because it relates directly to this topic. My first job writing television was for The Cosby Show. So I went from the theater and I started as a script writer and became a producer on The Cosby Show. I'm old, okay? So when I was a writer on The Cosby Show, there were 3 networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. There was this upstart called Fox Network. And there was this cable channel that showed movies without commercials called HBO. So that was the beginning of my career. And all my time working in New York and Hollywood to where we are now. Streaming service, I don't even have to explain to you, you know how many, my wife and I spend more time clicking through finding a movie than we actually watch movies, right? So here's the arc. 3 networks with an upstart HBO to what we have now. Now, there's a good and a bad side to this. The good side is if you want to watch The Voice on your phone on the subway, so be it, go watch it. The access that you have to the stories, right? That's wonderful. But unfortunately, what's happened in the Cosby Show days, it was appointment television. Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, the kids all had to huddle together at the same time in the same room, and this familial tribe would watch stories together. Where are we now? One kid's playing video games, the other one's on their phone. My wife's watching this. It's totally fragmented and disjointed. So the whole notion of a social network and social media connecting us does exactly the opposite. We are more disconnected than we ever have been. And this goes to what everyone on this panel is talking about, that communal experience of sitting in a room or 20 people staring at the same painting, hearing the same music. What happens is the energy in the audience starts, your soul expands, and that energy starts bumping into the energy of other souls. And all of a sudden, you have this energy that is a group energy that is transformative. You can't have that if she's on her phone in one room and I'm on a TV in the other and Michael's playing video games in the basement. That doesn't exist. So I don't have any answers, but in my experience, starting on The Cosby Show until I retired from Hollywood a few years ago, that arc has been absolutely apparent, and I don't know where it's going. I'm not smart enough to predict that. But.
Thanks, Matt. Really fascinating context for why we're asking this question we are in this panel. And just a couple things that jumped out was the experience economy that Dean mentioned, and the aura of an object from Michael. I thought that was quite profound. And pointing out the equity issue of the financial inaccessibility of the arts for our youth, and certainly appointment television. I thought that was quite a nice piece there from Matt. All of that leads to sort of an interesting question that I think everyone is touching on a little bit, but I think it requires maybe a little more bluntness, is what's the greatest threat to how you see people consume and enjoy creative content? We're worried about the death of these things as dinosaurs, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what that threat is for your particular medium or others.
I didn't want to do this today, but since Michael mentioned Walter Benjamin, I'm going to do it. Some of you may be familiar with the theorist, situationist Guy Debord, who wrote a book called The Society of the Spectacle. And the primary thesis of his was that in late capitalism and a media-driven society, all experience tends towards a spectacle. And I think the reason I'm invoking that here is we've touched on, capitalism got amok. You can now pay extra to go to a museum when there are fewer people and have that more, I think, rich experience. The barrier of entry, and I think museums are one of the few cultural nonprofits that actually give it away more than performing arts groups. I can't believe, at least in this, and SCFD we have here, I don't know how many are locals, we have a 7-county wide, very, very small sales tax that funds cultural and scientific facilities. So some of that increases programs and goes a bit toward entrance barriers. But I do feel much of this is getting worse and worse and worse as we experience greater wealth and greater participation from the imperial class. I mean, if you look at who runs museums, the boards, oil and gas, finance, and so forth, it's making our problem even more challenging. And especially as the cost of just doing business in any organization goes up and up and up. I tend to feel that's a huge challenge, is that, and this may be for Friday, we have a panel on funding for the arts, but it will get worse before it ever gets better with the decreasing government support post the culture wars, the first culture wars of the second culture wars of the 1990s, early 1990s.
Anyone else want to take a stab?
I think Dean's very interesting. You're right about the default to spectacle. And I think the example you gave of the Van Gogh experience for me is that, because I thought it had nothing whatsoever to do with Van Gogh. Although the pictures were Van Gogh's paintings blown up much bigger than they are backlit. You know, the colours weren't the same colours. There was nothing like Van Gogh. But anyway, I think the danger is, the biggest threat, to answer your question, is that we become lazy in the arts and we follow certain formula of presentations. Yeah. And I think we need to challenge all those formulas, which is why I think it's good that we're experiencing things in different ways. But we need to hang on to the content, you know. But we need to understand, and as Lisa said as well, that people aren't going to pay a lot of money if you can do something else, like go to a rock concert and then you get the experience that you need. What is it that a rock concert gives them that means they will pay $150 or $200, or that a sports event does? And I've long had this theory. I once chaired a conversation. You know, why is football or soccer in my country, football in my country, soccer in yours? Sorry. Why is it better than theatre? Which is a kind of provocative title, but why? Because you don't know what's going to happen next. That's why it's so exciting. And yeah, I mean, we've got to make theatre as exciting as that. We've got to make the arts going to the gallery as exciting as that, I think. Without losing the content, I think it can be done.
Yeah, I was having thoughts along similar lines, Michael, just about sort of the insidious feedback loop that these new structures have created for artists, and them being forced within, you know, to operate within. I mean, you know, when I think about Netflix shows, which is an area, TV is not an area of expertise for me, but it feels like there's just these formulas that build upon themselves and get cannibalized in a way. And even to some extent, you know, the nonprofit model, I think, you know, American theater, for example, its forms have changed over the years, but with the nonprofit model, so much of, you know, the funding relies on donors, government funding that takes kind of the power away from the artists themselves. And so, you know, there are just these structures in which I think the artist's voice gets muted by the expectations, you know, around them and in the climate that they're inhabiting. And so I think questioning those models, it's not an easy answer. I don't have the answer, but putting the power in the hands of the artists, I think, is something to consider.
The only thing I would comment on what everyone's saying is just attention span and how you tell your story. Yeah. You know, I was talking to, this was several years ago, I had an idea, because working in the world I worked in, which was comedy and specifically TV, every other day someone would come up and go, I've got a great idea for a sitcom. I just need someone to write it. Yeah, no kidding. And so I thought, well, what if I took that idea and heard pitches and then actually created a sketch show based on an audience's pitch, and then they could see what they pitched come to life. And when I went out with this was 10 years ago, and I said, and we'll have, you know, little 3 to 5 minutes, and they went, no. And I went, why? They go, it can't be more than 90 seconds. No one will watch beyond that. Yeah. In fact, it should probably stop at 60 seconds. Yeah. And that's when I went, wow. okay. So we sit through 3.5 hours of Hamlet, but we can't sit through 90 seconds of a sketch comedy. And that to me is the whole ADHD dilemma of how we process. And even in the old days, as a playwright, there was a rule of thumb that if you were saying something important, because writing is always about selection and emphasis, if you had something important to say, warn the audience you were going to say it, and then remind the audience that you said it. Now think about that. That's how we processed information. Now it's, and if you don't process it in those first 3-4 seconds, then, and we do become addicted to the spectacle. Your eye naturally follows movement and light. Well, what do you think? So that ADHD syndrome is what I'm most concerned about as a storyteller. So, hello.
Saved by the bell.
May I say something, just particularly with your thoughts, Matt, and again, I'm agreeing with everything my co-panelists are saying, but there's something about television now that seems like an amazing art form, sort of post-Sopranos, and not that it wasn't when I was growing up with All in the Family or whatnot, but there's something about the level of quality we get through streaming.
Absolutely.
That has changed it into this extraordinary venue in your own living room to be able to watch whatever series you love or don't love. But
I think that's
kind of a renaissance in my view.
Yeah, the old network, you were locked into that, and then the studios turned out movies. 36 to 39 movies a year were released by the major studios.
Yeah.
That all went away. So now they released 9 or 10 movies a year. So all those artists who were making these movies weren't all going to work in network television. Streaming services came along. So you've got a hybrid of television, playwrights, filmmakers, all making that. And I think the best storytelling is in the streaming world. And, and I'm not going to name shows, but that world right now, if you want to watch quality storytelling on a screen, it's in the streaming service. So I agree with you, Dean, 100%.
Appreciate that follow-up. We're going to get to audience Q&A in a little bit, but we sort of had a morbid title of this panel, and there's sort of a fatalism to some of this, and no one wants to go the way of the dinosaurs. So let's flip it and go and really ask, what's the greatest opportunity? There's still a desire to crave content and have experiences. And so is it the audience that needs to change, or is it the curation and how we make those experiences to attract people? But what is the greatest opportunity? How envision yourself coming back to this panel 15 years ago and go, oh man, we changed this, and the ability for the arts community has now flourished because of this change. What do you see as those greatest opportunities in front of us that we have maybe a short window to seize, or is technological in nature, or is societal in nature?
We have more tools. In museums, sometimes the best way to achieve your educational goal or your content delivery is just a nice text panel, decent point size so we can all read it, simple, clean language, maybe 150 words at the most. But also this technology in museums, I've seen it used very well. Augmented reality, where you want to see what's inside of a mummy sarcophagus, for example, and you can use a device that actually in real time that you control and you move allows you to see those hidden moments, or to look at a fragment of an architectural frieze and have it complete the areas that aren't any longer extant, or underdrawing in a painting, things like that. I mean, that is the tool you really can't do without maybe clunky x-rays on your walls, but the tools are pretty exciting, and as long as they stay to our education mission, and I know education's important to you, Maya, I mean, there's a lot we can do, and it isn't an either-or situation, I hope.
Yeah, I'll just jump off of that to say, I am personally kind of a dinosaur for my age. I don't like technology. I'm not really on social media. But if I've learned anything from my students, it's that these tools have the power to really democratize these forms. I mean, I've had many students who have literally learned the guitar on YouTube and, have learned just a ton of a wealth of information from what's available online, and also have pointed out to me that there's a lot of artistic originality happening on these platforms, and utilizing the tools created through these platforms to take the art formed to a whole new level. I think the challenge is to pair that, big wide world of what's available online with tangible pathways for careers and opportunities, that can take that learning into the real world space and make something of it. And I think those pathways for young artists are not always clear, and they're not always equitable. And so, we have a program called Teen Producers at the Y, which is really about working with students who have a passion for the arts and an art form and are really talented in their own right, and also are interested in learning various pathways to careers in the arts and cultural organizations opening up their doors to them to explore what's available. So I think if both can be paired together, there's real opportunity there.
I think an opportunity has arisen because there is finally, I think, well, certainly in my country, and I don't know whether it's here, but I know it's in the UK, an acknowledgement that all human beings are creative. That it's not a kind of specialist thing that some people have and some people don't. So everybody in here is actually capable of making a film, writing a novel, performing on stage, which is what I believe, actually. But that's a fairly kind of new thing, and certainly it's being recognised in the UK. My wife, as it happens, is a relationship manager for the Arts Council. So she works for the Arts Council, and the Arts Council have just undergone a massive change in their funding strategies, where they are now saying they're trying to democratize it. They're trying to say, look, anybody can be this. They're putting money out into communities for the communities to make the kind of art they want, rather than some artists flying in and saying, this is great art, this is what I think is great art, look at this, which is a very different approach, and it's quite problematic. It's created, because some large creative institutions have been cut to allow this to happen, but I think it's probably got to happen at some point, however painful that is. So I think that's an opportunity.
You good?
I'm good.
All right. All right. Well, we've got a few audience questions. We might as well jump into them now. A couple here that I think are interesting, and I think they've been touched on a little bit. But there's certainly a concern and question about books and the physical. I think, Michael, you touched a little bit on its smell and its yellowing,
there's something
and
about
its
a book
age.
that is different from a reading
and
online.
it's tactile.
It's just the touch, the tactileness of it. You put it on it becomes part of your world and your bookshop.
They're not
in your
disposable, like a digital file. When you're done, it just goes away.
It has a memory. A book has a memory, and I think there is. It's like everybody loves second-hand bookshops, don't they? I mean, you can't resist going in and just, look at that.
But these questions center. I mean, I can tell you like to touch the books.
I do. There's not a problem there.
There's not.
That's
right. No,
it's not a problem.
The book gives consent to all. So, and I think, Maya, this touches on your work, which is this generational divide. And, I see this with my kids in elementary school. I mean, they're given an iPad in some forms. They are still reading books, but sometimes if they're struggling to handwrite, they're given an iPad to type on to create the pathways of expression rather than being held up on pen and pad. They can type it and learn to get their story and their thoughts out. And so a real question is how do we maintain, is there a way to maintain that tactile nature of books and handwriting with this next generation, and what are the tools to do that, and what are maybe the gaps in that? But there seemed to be a fair amount of concern as to how do we preserve that. So I don't know if you want to start with that, Maya.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think some of us have seen that kind of terrifying video of the 2-year-old swiping on a physical book, trying to turn the page. So it's real. There's some disturbing trends that, we're seeing, nationwide studies that reading for fun has become less common. I mean, look, I can only speak to what I do. We have a high school literary arts program at the Y, and we feature an author or a poet every semester who students come to see read live, which I think has great power, being in the physical space with the author. But we also have, built into the budget that we will buy physical copies of the book for each student. And what I'll say is there's a lot of excitement around that. I mean, that's not that's a novel thing for some of these high schoolers, and they really these books are beloved to them, in part again because they have the support of a teaching artist to really have this immersive experience with the book, and for their readings to be paired with some generative creative writing activities where they can really feel into and emulate to some extent the work of the writer. So I think again it's about putting in the effort as adults to invest in the physicality of the books and to make sure that our libraries are stocked and librarians are well paid and all of these things. I mean, it seems obvious, but it's apparently not. The other thing I guess I'll say is that trends to some extent are cyclical and organic, and I think the death and then resurgence of vinyl records is a great example. Vinyl sales these days are through the roof, and I think there is a connection point there that novelty matters, physicality of the form matters. There is something inherent in us that looks for that and seeks that out. So I think, again, we just, as educators, from that standpoint, need to put in the work to try. Well, educators are putting in the work. Bigger government folks need to be putting in the work to make sure that libraries are well stocked for students, because the want is there.
I'd agree with that, Mara. I'd just like to, I could add to what you say in saying that I don't think it's the form of how we demonstrate our creativity that's important. It's the content that is important. Yes. It's the quality of the ideas or the storytelling or whatever it is that actually matters, not how we do it, not what form we use.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Another question I think it was sort of posed. Kind of has to do with, it touches on the capitalism, and maybe this touches on on some of Matt's work, which is, things are either recorded or commercial free, and when they're seen after the fact, advertisers are missing or largely missing their way in. And so it seems like new mediums get created, and then it takes time for the capitalistic model to insert itself, and then a new model's formed to sort of bypass it again, and there's sort of this leapfrogging game occurring. And so really the question is how does the creative environment, at least certainly in broadcast, TV, or streaming or film, maintain that and keep going with that, or are they even a part of that equation, or are they kind of just reacted?
I can't answer that, because I was always on the creative side, and what Michael just said, content is king. If you are creating good content, content that people need or want to hear, it doesn't matter how it's distributed. Whether you're streaming, network, or whatever. I can't sit through commercials. I really can't. Buy this truck. Every 10 minutes. I just can't do it. I would pay truckloads of money not to ever see another commercial again. And how they infiltrate that and do that, I don't know. But I do know that going back to reading or watching, I have a 1-year-old granddaughter, okay? And already this child, if she goes to her play bin, the first thing she grabs is a book, because her mother was an educator. And fortunately, these are chewable books, so you can chew on them and slobber on them, and you can still read them. But that little brain has already been programmed that what's fun and exciting is to look at pictures and read stories. So education, yes, it falls on the educators, but it really begins at home. And if you have a single mother working with 4 kids and she's not there, how do we solve that problem? By instilling that curiosity. I'm way off course from what you asked. I don't know about the advertising and all of that. I just do know the more corporate greed gets involved, the more you diminish the quality of the content. And I'll give you a personal story. Again, the reason I left Hollywood. I had a lot of success, created a couple #1 shows. I was developing a comedy for a streaming service. So instead of 25 episodes in a season, it was only going to be 10. I went to the studio, I'm not going to name it, and there was the president of the studio, the VP of development, and 2 salespeople, the people that sell the show into syndication. These 2 gentlemen were born without curiosity or creativity. They were one
of the 2 that Michael is outside of his belief system, right? Yes.
And so their job is to go out and sell the show. And I'm to the president of the network, I stand up and I'm pitching, and I said, and at the 10th episode, the guy living next door, they have their first kiss. And this salesman jumped up and went, no, 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 they can't kiss. And I went, excuse me? He goes, they can't kiss. And I said, why? And he says, because on New Girl, when this character kissed this character, their key demographic dropped so many points. And literally, my brain exploded and splattered on the wall. And I go, I created 2 #1 shows, and you are telling me what my characters that I'm creating can and cannot do? I literally got in the car, drove back to the Wind Dancer offices, called my business partner, David McFadden, into the room. I said, I'm out of here. I said, I'm done. We're closing up shop. Because not the tail of the dog, the flea on the tail of the dog is now wagging the dog. And I'm not going to do this anymore. So that's when I closed up my production offices and moved back to New York. So.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that story, Matt, because it leads into the next question. And I think your experience and career certainly saw the apex of that corporate greed. And so I'm sort of curious, based on one of these questions, is with the economy from the artist perspective. And so I'm curious. So the question really is, how do you is it either personal guaranteed income, or what are the economics so that artists can flourish in an environment where they're not feeling like they're being stripped from the corporate greed aspect, but have a place to thrive, and so they're not worried about what's paycheck to paycheck as much as they are how to tell their next creative story or make their next creative curation. And so I think the question is really just centered about how do we change the economics from the bottom up to maybe enable the creative in a way that isn't there now in this sort of tough economic times. Yeah.
I don't want to gloat about the UK, but of course we have the BBC, which is paid for by everyone through a license fee, and that means we don't have advertising on it. So it's actually our BBC, if you like, and we tend to get the best quality programs on the BBC because of that. Now it's under threat. There is a threat at the moment because the current Conservative government are threatening to take, they don't like that idea, they're threatening to take away and force the BBC to rely on advertising funding revenue, which a lot of us are arguing vehemently against because it will change the content. So to argue what economic model, the economic model has to be different. You can't rely on advertising. We all have to pay for it if we want good quality television. Good quality, I would say we all have to pay for it if we want good quality art in a museum or wherever. We can't just sit back and have it funded for us by people who are selling us stuff.
I mean, interestingly, thinking about what you're saying, and I guess the nature of the question is too, I mean, there are certain screenplays you can't get made, for various reasons. All these franchises of comic book heroes, I believe you can get made pretty easily. But in the museum field, what's interesting is the funders, the private foundations, even family foundations, have made an effort to fund things that impact schools, school programs, families, free. It's rare that anyone under the age of 20, 18 would pay to go into a museum these days. And oftentimes that's through an endowment gift that funds the lost revenue, whatever that might have been. Yeah. And so it's interesting how the same thing, the market forces, I guess, that in some cases have made the art world a very terrible place, have also actually helped it turn around in some important ways in the last, 10, 15 years. Wouldn't you agree to a certain degree? There are funders that are driving more societal change than what institutions would do left to their own devices, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, it is good. It's very good. And I think in conversation with that, thinking about the artists themselves, I mean, something we're thinking about a lot is how we're cultivating a close network of artists who are really investing in education, and speaking to these young people and putting in the effort to make these experiences so special for them. And I think to that point, you know, when we're thinking about the role of the artist, and for me, our teaching artists, our educators who are going out into the schools, unfortunately, I think as programs grow, as you know, theaters and art spaces balloon, I don't know, they become almost assets to be secured in a way, you know, props or there's some way in which I think that, again, there's this like disempowerment, and I think about funding structures where we can fund artists more directly to do what they want to do, to produce their own work, to rent their own venues, to pay their own collaborators. There's something to that, I think, and particularly the artists who are growing and building their own, you know, models for education, for all of these realms that we're talking about, putting the power back in their hands. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Another question we have is really centered on the preservation of the street as a venue. And I look at Michael, because I think you've done some of this, where the brick and mortar of a place where we often ask people to come to the venue versus, and I remember this time at the planetarium, we tried to bring kids to the dome, but then we realized that was an equity issue unto itself, but also an accessibility to story and science. And so it was about, how do we get to the classroom? How do we get to that community event and get where people are? So in the fields and disciplines that you guys are in, how do you avoid the trapping of having to require everyone to come to your tent and think about how do you build tents where other people are in order to create greater accessibility to the content and the mediums that you guys are responsible for?
Yeah, well, of course, that's the problem, because the buildings are very intimidating to lots of people. The theatres, the museums, they are intimidating. One tries to make them not intimidating.
They're elite.
But they are elite, and they are for an elite group of people, and we have to kind of acknowledge that. So sometimes I think, yes, taking it out, instead of waiting for them to come to you, go to them. Is a very good example in London, which I'm quite proud of because my son's part of it. He's in something called the Brixton Chamber Orchestra. Now, the Brixton is quite a poor area of London. It was a kind of Afro-Caribbean ghetto for quite a while. It's going up. It's still lots of poor housing there. And there is a chamber orchestra who play, it's largely young kids, maybe in their early 20s, who play classical music. And what they do is they go into the actual estates and they set up and they start playing something, and it's free for anyone to come. And I've been in those places, it's amazing. And everybody comes out and, oh, look, let's go and have a look. And they do food and beer, and they take requests. And they can suddenly do a pop tune in the middle of, I don't know, a piece of Schubert or something. And it's fantastic, because those people would never go to a concert. So it's certainly happening in classical music. It's happening a little bit in theatre, but particularly in classical music. For instance, another place I go to where it's a disused car park in Peckham, and there's an orchestra who play in the car park, and you can hear the trains going outside while you're listening to a Beethoven symphony, and it doesn't matter at all. So, you know, I think it's what I said about finding new ways to excite an audience. And one of the new ways is actually to go outside of the buildings, which is why site-specific theatre is so interesting for young people, rather than being in a theatre. Actually go out and explore a new building you've never seen before.
Sometimes it's called placemaking. Do you know that term, placemaking? The whole idea of, you're right, you can sort of turn almost anything into a cultural center if that's your if that's your ambition.
Well, I think, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyone else have a response to that? You don't have to. We can move on to the next one. All right. Another question is really centered around the physical mediums. And this question really comes to how do we preserve the physical mediums like film or magnetic tape or using Kodak? I mean, they're, for film photography. Are the mediums just a vehicle, or is there something about the preservation of those mediums themselves that tell those stories or convey what you're trying to do, or is that really not the thing that is most important, whether it's the story regardless of the vehicle is used to portray it? I
think you have to preserve it, because when you look at happen with classic films where they're completely restored, and whether it's film or it's digital, whatever, that has to be preserved because that is part of the process of creating. And we can kick and scream, and I can be a purist and go, it's only the story, I don't care. No, so preserving, how you mentioned the word Kodak. My kids are obsessed with Polaroids, and I was a kid when they first came out. And wow, you fanned it and there you were. And that's come back like vinyl. So if we didn't preserve that, my kids and my grandchild will not ever experience that. So I think it's vital that we preserve it. I don't think we should make it God and let technology override the creativity and the content, but it must be preserved, I think.
It's a huge instance or issue in museums, photography, new media, time-based media, things that were done on Betamax tape and used in a more sculptural way as opposed to a digital file that can project. I mean, it's a huge issue. Even beyond new media, I mean, there are certain sculptures, paintings that have inherent vice, can never be brought back. So preservation's huge. I mean, it's built into what museums' missions are, so it's a little bit more day-to-day. But I can't speak for the film or the warehouse of films that went up in flames. I can't remember, it was 5-6 years ago. But I think it's built into museums.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it goes back to the aura, Benjamin's aura, that we need to preserve the thing. So we've got it. It's theatre where it becomes difficult, actually, because theatre disappears at the point of delivery. Theatre is only there at that moment with those people in that room, and then it's gone. You can't. And I would agree with Peggy Phelan. You can't film it. You can film it, but it's not the theatre.
It's a document.
It's a document, and it's not the real thing. So preserving the actual theatrical thing is almost impossible because of the nature of the beast. But that's different in writing, books, television, museums.
Wonderful, thank you. We're closing in towards, we've got about 13 minutes left, so I want to make sure we're respectful of people's time. Another question that jumps in is, again, we touched about the threats and opportunities in your respective fields. We sort of obviously joked that the way of the dinosaur, but let's do maybe a thought question of, if you rubbed the bottle and the genie came out, and you could kind of pick one thing that you would fix or change to allow your field or your discipline and creative space to thrive, and it can't be money.
That's
the analogy would be how do you go from going the way of the dinosaur to going the way of the mammal, and actually evolve to be the dominant species more or less, rather than the one that gets dug up underground. So what would be that one thing that's not money that would resuscitate your area?
This comes full circle again, but I mean, art museums especially, well, maybe other forms of leisure time activities, but we serve such a small percent of our community, however you want to define that. I mean, infinitesimal, really, number of people that actually go to museums. So they go to them a lot, but 90-some% don't go to them ever. And so I think if you could change one thing, it would be greater participation from your generally regional audience. Not all museums are international, like New York or Paris or somewhere. So I think that's how I'd answer it.
Michael, what you thinking?
Well, I'm going to say something, I'm not sure I believe this, but I think I do. Get rid of all the theatres, the buildings. Get rid of all the theatres, put all the money that you put into the theatres into people creating theatre in a different way. Maybe in buildings that may not be theatres. So I'm not saying theatre has to be outside of buildings, although it can be. It can be in the shopping mall, it can be in fields, but it can be in other places. And I actually think that would shift something very major, because often the buildings are a problem. Like I say, they are temples to culture. That's a problem for lots of people. They are elitist. And I speak as someone who worked in the theatre for many years. But theatre doesn't need the bricks and mortar. It's something more vital than that. It's something more essential to the everyday lives. And just maybe that's the thing that comes and destroys what was it? It was something. It was a thing that destroyed the dinosaurs. I'm trying to think what it is.
A meteor.
A meteor. Thank you. Yeah, maybe that's the meteor that actually shifts along, and the mammals arrive, and it's actually better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I feel like my answer couldn't be more obvious in a way, and also does come back to money, but it's not explicitly money, which is, a dedicated, passionate arts educator in every school. And I think that's it. I think that, classical education and just breeding a love of the arts in young people, it comes from role models, and those are educators, and they are the ones who make us love books and help us understand why jazz matters and why it's connected to what we listen to. It's all pretty simple. Yeah.
I'll just double down on that. I don't need to add. My son's an educator, his wife's an educator, and you see in the earliest stages of these children's life when that passion is ignited, and they're not all going to grow up to be concert violinists, but they have an appreciation. And so I would double down on what you just said.
I just want to add to that. My daughter actually works in with 5 and 6 year olds in English. She just started teaching, and talking to the other teachers there, in the last 5 to 10 years, have cut all the funding for artists to go in, all the funding for music, to go in, and they had nobody even to paint their pantomime at Christmas. So I did it, because I can. But I mean, that's not the answer. There should be work. There's work for people. There's lots of artists out there who are capable of it, and the funding has just been slashed for that kind of thing, which is what disgusts me.
I liked your idea of tearing down the theaters.
Yeah, I mean,
it's controversial.
Not with people in,
Yeah.
safely. Maybe they convert it into a different use of something, maybe housing for people who haven't got homes.
It's interesting in the museum field. I think many of you will know, between roughly 1985 and 2005, all these new additions and wings and expansions, and the operating costs are directly attributable to the reasons museums are getting so expensive. Bigger isn't always better. Yeah. I don't think. Yeah. Dangerous.
Well, thank you for that. In sort of closing, as we're finally the last few minutes here, I want to sort of turn it back to you guys. Is there something you heard one of your colleagues up here say that you either 100% agree with, or you I am going to have to challenge you on that one? I'm just sort of curious if something you've heard, because there's been a lot of good agreement, and I'm just curious if there's something that's really stood out, if there's a takeaway that you've heard one of your colleagues up here say in a soundbite. What would that be?
That kids want books, that they get excited by them when given the opportunity to have them. Yeah, that's extraordinary.
I haven't really disagreed with anything anybody said. I mean, I can't make that up.
Tear the theaters down.
No, quite well. Maybe some people don't want to tear them. Don't want to tear things down.
But I think the problem, Sisyphus stone, is on the back of the educators. We dump everything on the educators to teach our children morality even. So everything's on the back of the educators, and then we don't give them money, sorry to bring up the M word, money to actually educate. So then how do young children get inculcated in the proper way and introduced to the arts? And if it's not educators, it's got to be family. Social, economic, we can know all the reasons why. Then is that community centers? Is that libraries? I have a dear friend, she's now head of all the libraries in LA. Her primary focus is how to deal with homeless people and schizophrenia. Because that's where and she has taken that on, and she's devised a program of how to hand out toothpaste and towels and soap to these people, and how do we meet their need? And I go, what about school children? And this is the problem we're facing. So how do we start them at a very early age, under the age of 5? And yes, it always falls on the educator. And then I don't think I'm making this up. There was a private school in LA, this was 15 years ago, that stripped out the arts because they said grading arts is too subjective and it will hurt my children's GPA and they won't be able to get into the school they wanted. So the school board voted out the arts program, so everything was STEM. And nothing wrong with STEM. But when that's not there, how do we teach our children? You know, and I applaud the educators, and like I said, I double down with you, Maya.
Yeah, I mean, the most important person on this panel is Maya in terms of, well, in terms of affecting change.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important. I just think I was going to have a point there, what you were saying about grading. Yeah, I ran a project in England because I always hated grading arts, because I always felt it was, not that it is subjective, but actually I felt the problem is it shouldn't be graded. We should talk to students about their work rather than saying this is good, this is bad. That's a problem. It's okay in math and in science where you've got these right or wrong. There's a right way to do it. In art, it's about doing something in a different way. And therefore, I objected to a system that had a set of learning objectives that were the same for every student, that I had to judge people that were so different against one set of criteria. And I set up this project called Feral Space, which was about not marking the arts, which went down very badly with the management of the university where I was working with at the time. But there you are.
And I think that there's I'm going to try to tie this up with a bow nicely, and it's probably not going to work, but there's something you all have gotten me thinking a lot about, which is the importance of the organic, messy nature of the creative process. Yes. That the spectacle that we're talking about is so packaged, and that the moment that you don't know what's going to happen of live art is, to me, the most beautiful thing in the world. And I think, again, goes back to why we're all here and doing what we're doing, and why I hope to God that kiss happened. You know, it's like these moments that I cannot be dictated by an algorithm.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to close, Maya, and you did tie a nice bow on all of this. So thank you so much. Well, that closes our time here on the panel. We've had a great time talking about this. And I do want to just say, let's applaud our panelists here, both Dean, Michael, Maya, and Matt, for a thought-provoking conversation. And even though there may have sounded some doom and gloom, I come out feeling hopeful and opportunistic that the artistic community will continue to thrive. And certainly, if the four of you have anything to do about it, then I do feel confident in its outcome. So thank you guys for being here and appreciate your thoughts. And thank you all for joining us here at CWA. We hope you enjoy the rest of your time here on campus for the next couple of days and enjoy the panels. Be well, be safe, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, really good.